The unknown regions had always been a place of whispers and warnings, a frontier where starlight grew cold and ancient things slept in the silence between worlds. The Chiss ascendancy had patrolled those boundaries for generations, their crimson eyes scanning the void for threats that predated the Old Republic, for nightmares that existed before the Sith carved their first holocron. They had seen empires rise and collapse into dust. They had watched species ascend to glory and vanish without a trace, but they had never seen anything like the thing that came through the rift. It began with a fracture in the fabric of space itself, a wound torn across the membrane of reality where hyperspace touched the physical realm. The tear pulsed with colors that had no name, hues that existed outside the spectrum of known light, and from within that wound came a hunger so vast it swallowed entire systems before the inhabitants could comprehend their doom. The frontier colony of Rakata Prime, a world of scattered ruins and forgotten technology, disappeared first, not destroyed, not conquered, consumed. Its star dimmed to a lifeless ember in the span of minutes, its planetary mass reduced to scattered molecular dust, and then even that dust was gone, pulled into the maw of something incomprehensible. The Chiss watchers stationed at the border outpost of Cecilla's Eye recorded it all with the cold precision their culture demanded, their instruments tracking the impossible energies, their analysts recognizing immediately that this was not a weapon, not a fleet, not even a conventional threat. This was a force of nature. This was an ending made manifest. And it was coming deeper into the galaxy, following the currents of hyperspace, as if those ancient roots were rivers leading to an ocean of prey. Grand Admiral Thrawn stood in the observation deck of the Chimera, his hands clasped behind his back, his red eyes reflecting the holographic display that dominated the center of the room. The image showed the region of space where Rakata Prime had once existed, now nothing but an empty coordinate on the star charts. Around him, his officers maintained their stations with disciplined silence, waiting for his assessment, trusting in the strategic genius that had made him legend. But even Thrawn felt the weight of this moment, the recognition that all his study of art and culture, all his understanding of tactics and psychology might be insufficient against an enemy that did not think, did not plan, did not care. He had read the reports from the Chiss scouts 17 times. He had analyzed the energy signatures, the spatial distortions, the way the very Force itself seemed to recoil from the presence of this thing, the Force. Thrawn had always viewed it with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a phenomenon he could not personally experience, but he had learned to respect it, to factor it into his calculations. And now the Force was screaming. Every Force-sensitive being within 100 parsecs of the event had felt it, a disturbance so profound it transcended the usual tremors that accompanied death and destruction. Jedi across the galaxy had collapsed mid-meditation, their minds brushing against a hunger that existed beyond darkness, beyond the Sith's corrupting malice, beyond anything the light or dark sides had prepared them to comprehend. It was not evil. It was not good. It simply was. And that was somehow worse. Thrawn turned from the display and moved to his private terminal, composing a message that would violate every protocol of the Ascendancy, that would expose classified intelligence to enemies who had sought his destruction only months before. But survival demanded adaptation, and this threat made old enmities irrelevant. He encoded the data, attached the sensor logs, and transmitted it on 2 channels simultaneously, one to the Imperial High Command on Coruscant, one to the Jedi Temple ruins where he knew Luke Skywalker and his new order had established their fragile presence. The message was brief, clinical, devastating. An unknown entity has breached our reality and is consuming star systems at an accelerating rate. Initial calculations suggest it will reach the core worlds within weeks. This enemy does not negotiate, it does not conquer, it feeds. Respond immediately. The galaxy waited. On the forest moon of Endor, Luke Skywalker stood among the ancient trees, his green lightsaber extinguished and clipped to his belt, his mind reaching out through the Force to touch the lives of his students. His sister, the scattered remnants of the Jedi he was slowly gathering from across the stars. He had been in meditation when the disturbance struck, and the vision that followed had nearly killed him. He had seen systems dying, not in fire but in silence, their lights simply ceasing as if the galaxy itself were forgetting they had ever existed. He had seen something moving through the void, something vast beyond comprehension, and behind it, smaller figures, heralds, servants, extensions of the greater hunger. Leia had found him collapsed on the meditation platform, his nose bleeding, his hands trembling. She had called for help, and now he sat in the small council chamber they had built from salvaged Imperial materials, surrounded by the few Jedi who had answered his call. There was Mara Jade, still wrestling with her past as the Emperor's hand, her green eyes sharp and skeptical. There was Kyle Katarn, the former mercenary who had embraced the Force late in life and brought a soldier's pragmatism to the Order. There was Silgal, the Mon Calamari healer whose connection to the living Force ran deeper than anyone Luke had ever known. And there was Leia herself, her training still incomplete, but her presence in the Force growing stronger every day, her political instincts as valuable as any lightsaber technique. Luke shared what he had seen, his voice steady despite the horror of the memory. He described the hunger, the way it moved through space as if distance meant nothing, the sense of inevitability that accompanied it. Mara Jade interrupted, her tone cutting through the dread that had settled over the group like fog. She asked the question that mattered: could they fight it? Luke met her gaze and admitted he did not know. The Force offered no guidance here, no vision of triumph or tragedy, only a sense of wrongness, of something that should not exist touching the fabric of their reality. Leia spoke next, her voice carrying the authority of a princess, a general, a woman who had stared down the Death Star and lived to rebuild a republic from its ashes. She reminded them that the new republic was still fragile, still recovering from the Civil War, still torn between factions who saw the Jedi as saviors and those who saw them as dangerous relics. If this threat was as dire as Luke suggested, they would need allies. They would need the Empire. They would need everyone. The words hung in the air like a blasphemy. Kyle Katarn laughed, a bitter sound that carried no humor. He pointed out that the Empire had tried to exterminate them, that even now Imperial remnants hunted Force sensitives across the Outer Rim, that asking for their help was like asking a Rancor to defend the Sarlacc. But Silgal's gentle voice cut through his anger, reminding them that survival meant setting aside pride, that the Force connected all living things, and if those things ceased to exist, their ideological disputes would not matter. Luke closed his eyes and reached out through the Force again, this time not searching for guidance but for confirmation. He felt the galaxy stretching around him, billions of lights representing lives, hopes, fears, and he felt the shadow at the edge of that light, creeping closer, patient and inexorable. He opened his eyes and nodded. They would need everyone. They would need a miracle. The message from Thrawn arrived 3 hours later, and with it came data that turned suspicion into certainty and hope into something colder. On Coruscant, the Imperial High Command received Thrawn's transmission with the skepticism that had defined their careers. The Empire had fractured after the Emperor's death at Endor, splitting into warlord territories and ideological factions. But here in the capital, a core of admirals and moffs still clung to the machinery of power. They gathered in the war room deep beneath the former Senate building, a chamber lined with holographic projectors and tactical displays, and they examined the data with the clinical detachment of men who had ordered planetary bombardments and considered it policy. Admiral Ray Sloane stood at the head of the table, her gray uniform immaculate, her expression revealing nothing. She had survived the power struggles that followed the Emperor's demise by being smarter than her rivals and more ruthless than her allies. She trusted Thrawn's strategic assessments more than she trusted anyone else in the room. But even she found the report difficult to accept. An entity that consumed star systems. An enemy that could not be negotiated with, infiltrated, or turned. It violated every principle of warfare she had learned. Moff Pandian, a corpulent man whose wealth came from strip mining operations in the Mid-Rim, dismissed the threat as Chiss propaganda, a fabrication designed to draw Imperial resources into the unknown regions where Thrawn could consolidate his power. Others murmured agreement, their paranoia sharpened by years of betrayal and counter-betrayal, but Sloane silenced them with a gesture, pointing to the sensor data that showed energy readings beyond anything their physicists could explain, to the timestamps that confirmed an entire system had vanished in less than an hour. She made her decision with the cold calculation that had kept the Empire alive when lesser leaders would have let it collapse. They would send a task force to investigate, a small fleet commanded by someone expendable but competent. If the threat was real, they would know soon enough. If it was a trap, the loss would be acceptable. She assigned the mission to Captain Pelion, Thrawn's former protege, a man whose loyalty to the Empire was exceeded only by his respect for the Grand Admiral. He accepted without hesitation, understanding that this might be a death sentence but trusting that Thrawn did not issue warnings lightly. The fleets began to move. In the deep meditation chambers beneath the ancient temple of the Kyber on Jeddah, the Guardians of the Will stirred from their contemplative silence. They were not Jedi, though they served the Force in their own way. They were monks and warriors, historians and mystics, keepers of knowledge that predated the Republic. Their order had survived the Purge by retreating into obscurity, by guarding their sacred texts and waiting for the day when the galaxy would need their wisdom again. That day had arrived. Chirrut Îmwe, blind but seeing more than those with eyes, walked the stone corridors of the temple with his staff tapping a steady rhythm against the floor. He had felt the disturbance weeks before the rift opened, a dissonance in the Force that made his prayers feel hollow, his connection to the cosmic current strained as if something were pulling at the fabric of existence itself. His partner, Baze Malbus, had noticed Chirrut's unease and had checked the perimeter defenses, preparing for an attack that never came, not yet. Now they stood in the chamber where the great Kyber crystals grew from the living rock, their light pulsing with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the Force. But the crystals were dimming, their glow fading at the edges, as if a shadow were creeping over them. Chirrut placed his hand against the largest crystal and felt its pain, its fear, and behind that fear he sensed the thing that approached. The hunger, the void, the ending. Baze asked what they should do, and Chirrut smiled. That serene expression that infuriated his friend because it suggested Chirrut already knew something Baze did not. Chirrut said they would do what they always did. They would protect the temple, the crystals, the Force itself. And if that meant walking into the mouth of oblivion, then the Force would guide their steps. Baze muttered that the Force had a cruel sense of humor, but he checked his heavy repeating blaster anyway, making sure the power cells were charged, that his armor was intact. They had survived the Death Star. They would survive this, or they would die trying. The first true engagement came at the Vruna system, a mining colony at the edge of the Outer Rim where the New Republic maintained a small garrison and the Empire had secret supply depots hidden among the asteroids. Captain Pelion's task force arrived to find the system's sun flickering, its corona pulsing with unnatural rhythms, and in orbit around the dying star, structures that defied description. They were not ships. Not exactly. They were constructs, biomechanical entities that seemed to exist half in real space and half in some other dimension, and they were feeding, drawing energy directly from the sun's core, siphoning its nuclear fire into conduits that led back through the rift to something waiting beyond. Pelion ordered his fleet into defensive formation and opened a channel to the nearest construct, broadcasting on every frequency, demanding identification and intent. The response came not in words but in sensation, a pressure against his mind that made his vision blur and his hands shake. He was not Force sensitive, But he felt it anyway, a mind so vast it made the Emperor's dark presence seem like a candle compared to a star, and behind that mind, the hunger, always the hunger. The constructs turned their attention to the Imperial fleet, and the battle began. It was unlike any engagement Pellaeon had commanded. The enemy did not fire turbo lasers or launch starfighters. Instead, they extended tendrils of energy that passed through deflector shields as if the shields did not exist, latching onto the hulls of Imperial star destroyers and beginning to drain them. Not just their power, not just their structural integrity, but something deeper. The crews reported feeling weak, dizzy, as if their very life force were being pulled from their bodies. Ships went dark, not because their reactors failed, but because the energy that sustained them simply ceased to exist. Pellaeon ordered a retreat after losing 2 destroyers and a dozen support craft, and his fleet jumped to hyperspace with the constructs not pursuing. They did not need to pursue. They had already fed, and the Fruna sun collapsed into a white dwarf hours later, its light extinguished, its planets frozen and lifeless. Pellaeon transmitted his report with shaking hands, and for the first time in his career, he added a personal note: "We cannot fight this. We can only run." The report reached Thrawn, Sloane, and the Jedi Council simultaneously, and the galaxy began to understand the scale of what was coming. Thrawn convened a meeting that should have been impossible, a gathering of Imperial commanders, New Republic officials, and Jedi representatives on neutral ground, the ancient space station of Sanctuary, a derelict orbital facility that had once served as a diplomatic hub during the Clone Wars. The fact that anyone agreed to come spoke to their desperation. The fact that they did not immediately kill each other spoke to their fear. Thrawn entered the conference chamber flanked by 2 royal guards, their crimson armor a reminder of the Emperor's legacy, and took his seat at the circular table without ceremony. Across from him, Luke Skywalker sat with Leia at his side, their expressions guarded but open. To Thrawn's left, Admiral Sloane represented the Imperial remnant, her uniform bearing the insignia of the Grand Admiralty. To his right, Mon Mothma spoke for the New Republic Senate, her presence a symbol of the fragile democracy they were trying to build. And scattered around the table were others, Chiss observers, Bothan spies, a representative from the Hutt cartels who understood that credits meant nothing if there were no customers left to extort. Thrawn began without preamble, activating the central hologram and displaying the data from a dozen engagements, the pattern of consumption spreading like a cancer across the galactic map. He explained what their combined intelligence had pieced together. The entity they faced was not a species, not a fleet, not even a conventional life form. It was a cosmic force, a being of such immense power and scale that it existed partially outside their reality, feeding on the fundamental energies that bound the universe together. It consumed stars to sustain itself, drawing their nuclear fire through constructs that served as both heralds and feeding mechanisms. Luke interrupted, his voice steady but strained, and shared what the Force had revealed. This entity was not inherently evil, but it was anathema to life itself. The Force, which connected all living things, recoiled from it because the entity's very existence disrupted the web of life and death, creation and destruction that gave the Force meaning. Thrawn nodded, acknowledging the information, and added that the entity's movement suggested intelligence, or at least purpose. It was not random. It was following hyperspace lanes, targeting systems with the highest population density, the most developed infrastructure. It was optimizing its feeding. Sloane asked the question everyone was thinking: could they stop it? Thrawn's pause was answer enough, but he elaborated anyway. Their combined fleets represented the most powerful military force in the galaxy, but conventional weapons had proven ineffective. The constructs absorbed energy attacks and ignored kinetic projectiles. Planetary shields failed within minutes of their arrival. Even the Death Star, had it still existed, would likely have been consumed before it could fire. They needed a new approach, They needed to understand the enemy before they could fight it. Leia spoke then, her voice carrying the weight of leadership and loss. She proposed an expedition to the rift itself, a small team composed of their best scientists, strategists, and force sensitives, tasked with finding the source of the threat and determining if there was a way to close the breach or communicate with the entity. It was a suicide mission, but it was also their only hope. If they could understand what they faced, they might find a weakness. If they could delay its advance, they might buy time to evacuate the core worlds. If they could do nothing else, they could at least die knowing they tried. The room fell silent as the weight of that proposal settled over them. Thrawn studied the faces around the table, reading the fear and determination in equal measure, and he made his own offer. He would lead the expedition personally, bringing with him the analytical resources of the Chiss ascendancy and the tactical expertise that had made him the Empire's greatest commander. But he would need the Jedi. He would need Luke Skywalker and whoever else could wield the Force, because if there was any chance of communicating with an entity that existed beyond conventional matter, it would come through that mystical energy field. Luke met Thrawn's gaze, and for a moment, the Jedi and the Imperial shared an understanding that transcended their ideological divide. They were both servants of order in their own way, both seeking to protect something larger than themselves. Luke agreed, and with that agreement, the impossible alliance was forged. The mission would depart in 3 days, time enough to gather supplies and volunteers, but not so long that the entity would consume another dozen systems while they debated. The meeting adjourned with a fragile sense of purpose, and as the delegates filed out, Thrawn remained behind, studying the holographic display, calculating odds that refused to add up to victory. Leia found Luke on the observation deck hours later, staring out at the stars, his expression distant. She asked if he truly believed they could succeed, and he admitted he did not know. The Force was silent on this matter, offering no visions of the future, no guidance about the path ahead. It was as if the entity's presence had created a blind spot in destiny itself, a region where prophecy could not reach. But he knew they had to try. He knew that doing nothing was the only guaranteed failure. She placed a hand on his shoulder and reminded him that he had faced the Emperor and survived, that he had redeemed their father when everyone else believed Vader was beyond saving. If anyone could find a way through this darkness, it was him. Luke smiled at that, a sad expression that did not reach his eyes. He pointed out that the Emperor had been a man, twisted and powerful, but still bound by the limits of mortality. What they faced now was something else entirely. It was a god, if such things existed, and gods did not fall to lightsabers. Leia's response was simple. Then, we will find a bigger weapon. The preparations began in earnest. Thrawn assembled a crew from across the galaxy, engineers who understood hyperspace mechanics, xenobiologists who specialized in exotic life forms, weapons specialists who had worked on projects so classified even the Emperor had not known all the details. From the Jedi, Luke brought Mara Jade, whose pragmatism balanced his idealism, and Kyle Katarn, whose combat experience would be invaluable. Silgal volunteered despite Luke's protests, insisting that if they were venturing into the unknown, they would need a healer. And to everyone's surprise, Chirrut and Baze arrived at the rendezvous point, having traveled from Jedha with a small chest containing kyber crystals and ancient texts, claiming the Force had guided them here. The ship Thrawn selected was the Dauntless, a modified Imperial-class Star Destroyer outfitted with experimental shielding technology and retrofitted hyperdrives that could navigate the unstable space near the rift. It was a warship, but Thrawn had no illusions about fighting their way through this mission. Speed and stealth would be their weapons, along with whatever insights the Force could provide. The crew numbered 300, a skeleton staff compared to the Dauntless's full complement, but enough to operate the ship and conduct research. They departed from Sanctuary Station under the gaze of a dozen fleets. representatives of nations that had been at war for decades, now watching their best hope vanish into hyperspace, bound for a destination none of them fully understood. The journey would take days, even with the Dauntless's advanced drives, and during that time, the crew settled into a routine that felt both familiar and surreal. Imperial officers worked alongside New Republic technicians. Jedi meditated in chambers next to Chiss analysts, and Thrawn spent his hours studying the data, searching for patterns in the chaos. Luke found him in the strategy room on the second day, the walls covered with holographic projections showing the entity's movements, energy readings, projected trajectories. Thrawn acknowledged the Jedi's presence without looking up, and Luke asked what the Grand Admiral saw that others did not. Thrawn's answer was characteristically precise. He saw adaptation. Each time the entity's constructs encountered resistance, they modified their approach. When the Empire used concentrated turbo-laser fire, the constructs developed energy absorption capabilities. When the New Republic tried mass driver rounds, the constructs phased partially out of real space to avoid impact. The entity was learning, evolving its tactics in real time. Luke absorbed this information and offered his own observation. The Force suggested the entity was not truly malevolent, not in the way the Sith were malevolent. It did not hate or seek to dominate. It simply needed to feed. And in feeding, it destroyed. That made it neither good nor evil, but it did make it incompatible with life as they understood it. Thrawn considered this and asked if the Force offered any insight into the entity's origin, its purpose beyond feeding. Luke shook his head, but he mentioned the kyber crystals Chirrut had brought, noting that they resonated with the Force in ways even Jedi did not fully understand. Perhaps there was something in those ancient stones that could help them. The third day brought them to the edge of the rift, and the sight that greeted them silenced even the most jaded crew members. The rift was a wound in space itself, a tear that stretched across light years, its edges pulsing with energies that made the ship's sensors scream in protest. Through the tear, they glimpsed something vast and terrible, a shape that their minds could not fully process, a form that existed in dimensions their eyes were not built to perceive. It was the entity, Galactus, the devourer of worlds, and even in distant glimpses, it radiated a presence that made the crew feel like insects staring at a star. Thrawn ordered the Dauntless to hold position at a safe distance, and he dispatched probe droids to map the area, to gather data on the rift's structure and the constructs that moved through it. The droids transmitted for 17 minutes before their signals went dark, but that was enough. The data revealed that the constructs were not ships but extensions of Galactus himself, appendages reaching through the rift to feed him, and the energy they gathered flowed back along conduits that existed in both real space and hyperspace simultaneously. Destroying the constructs would not stop the feeding. They would need to close the rift itself. But closing a wound in the fabric of reality was beyond any technology they possessed, and even the Force offered no clear path. Luke gathered the other Force sensitives in the meditation chamber, and together they reached out, not to attack or defend, but to understand. They touched the edges of the rift with their minds, feeling its wrongness, its hunger, and they sensed something else, a consciousness, vast and ancient, that regarded them with the same disinterest a human might show an ant. Galactus was aware of them, but he did not care. They were irrelevant to his purpose. Mara Jade broke the meditation first, gasping as if she had been drowning, her face pale and her hands trembling. She reported that she had felt the entity's mind, and it was nothing like the Emperor's twisted intellect. The Emperor had been cruel because he chose to be. Galactus simply existed, and his existence required consumption. There was no malice, no joy, no emotion at all, just need. Kyle Katarn added that he had sensed something else, a faint echo of other galaxies, other realities that Galactus had visited before, leaving nothing but empty void in his wake. They were not the first to face him. They were just the latest. Silgal's voice, gentle and sorrowful, posed the question that haunted them all. If Galactus was a force of nature, could they truly stop him, or were they merely delaying the inevitable? Luke had no answer, but Chirrut spoke from the corner of the chamber, his blind eyes turned toward a point none of the others could see. He said the force was balance, light and dark, creation and destruction, and this entity threatened that balance. Therefore, the force would provide a way, even if that way demanded sacrifice beyond what they were prepared to give. The words hung heavy in the chamber, and Baze, standing beside his friend, muttered that the Force had a nasty habit of asking for everything and promising nothing in return. But they were here now, and turning back was not an option. Thrawn's voice crackled over the intercom, summoning them to the bridge. One of the constructs had changed course and was approaching the Dauntless. Contact was imminent. The construct was the size of a star destroyer, but shaped like no ship they had ever seen, a twisting mass of metallic flesh and crystalline structures that pulsed within a light. It moved through space without visible propulsion, gliding toward them with inexorable patience. Thrawn ordered the shields raised and all weapons armed, but he did not fire. Not yet. He wanted to observe, to learn, to see if there was anything in the construct's behavior that suggested vulnerability. The crew watched in tense silence as the construct closed the distance, and when it was within a kilometer, it stopped. A beam of light shot from the construct to the Dauntless, and the ship's systems went haywire. Lights flickered, consoles sparked, crew members stumbled as the gravity fluctuated. But the beam was not an attack, it was a scan, an examination. The construct was studying them, and through it, Galactus was learning about this new galaxy, this new source of sustenance. Luke felt the entity's attention settle over them like a weight, and he instinctively ignited his lightsaber, the green blade casting harsh shadows across the bridge. The gesture was futile, he knew, but it was a declaration. They would not submit willingly. The scan ended as abruptly as it began, and the construct withdrew, returning to the rift. Thrawn watched it go and ordered his analysts to review every sensor reading, every bit of data the ship had collected during the encounter. He was looking for anything, a power signature, a structural weakness, a pattern in the construct's movement that could be exploited. The analysis took hours, and when Thrawn finally called another meeting, his expression was grim. He explained that the construct's energy readings matched the signatures they had detected at Runa and other consumed systems, confirming that each construct was a direct extension of Galactus. But more importantly, the scan had revealed something about the Dauntless itself, the ship's reactors, its crew's biological signatures, even the kyber crystals Chirrut had brought. Galactus was cataloging them, determining how much energy they represented, whether they were worth consuming. They had become prey, and the hunter had taken their measure. Leia, who had remained on Sanctuary Station to coordinate the defense efforts, transmitted an urgent message. 2 more systems had gone dark while the Dauntless was at the rift. The entity's feeding was accelerating, and projections suggested it would reach the mid-rim within a week, the core worlds within 2. Time was running out. Thrawn acknowledged the transmission and made his decision. They could not close the rift, not with the resources they had, but they could attempt something more desperate. They could try to communicate, to bargain, to offer Galactus an alternative to consuming their galaxy. Luke immediately saw the danger in that plan. Bargaining required leverage, and they had none. What could they possibly offer an entity that devoured stars? Thrawn's answer was cold and logical. They could offer themselves, not as a meal, but as heralds. They could guide Galactus to uninhabited systems, regions of space where his feeding would cause no loss of life. It would buy time, allow evacuations, preserve the species that made up the galaxy's population. It was not victory, but it was survival. Mara Jade called it surrender, and she was not wrong. Kyle Katarn argued they would be complicit in their own destruction, feeding the monster that would eventually consume them anyway. But Silgal pointed out that every day they delayed Galactus's arrival in the core worlds was another day for billions to escape, another day for scientists to search for a real solution. And Chirrut, ever the mystic, suggested that perhaps communication was not about bargaining but about understanding. If they could truly touch Galactus's mind, perhaps they could find the flaw in his nature, the crack through which hope might enter. The debate raged for hours, but in the end, Luke made the decision. He was the most powerful Force-sensitive present, and he would attempt the contact. Thrawn would provide the strategic framework, and the others would support him, anchoring him to reality so the entity's vastness did not sweep him away. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation had defined their mission from the beginning. They prepared in the meditation chamber, Chirrut laying out the Kyber crystals, in a pattern that matched ancient diagrams from the Will's texts, a configuration meant to amplify the Force and create a bridge between minds. Luke sat at the center of the circle, his breathing slow and controlled, his mind reaching out not toward the light or the dark, but toward something beyond both. Mara, Kyle, and Silgal formed a triangle around him, their own connections to the Force reinforcing his, preventing him from losing himself in the vastness. Baze stood guard at the door, his blaster ready, as if he could shoot a cosmic entity should things go wrong. Luke's consciousness expanded, moving beyond his body, beyond the ship, beyond the rift itself. He touched the mind of Galactus, and the contact nearly destroyed him. It was like diving into a star, an endless inferno of need and hunger that had no beginning and no end. He saw galaxies consumed, realities drained, entire timelines reduced to nothing. He felt the weight of eons, the burden of existence stretched across dimensions, and he understood finally that Galactus was not a villain. He was a constant, a universal law given form, the embodiment of entropy's hunger. But within that vastness, Luke found something unexpected: weariness. Galactus did not hunger because he enjoyed it. He hungered because he had to, because his existence was bound to that need, and there was no escape, no rest, no end. He was as much a prisoner of his nature as his victims were of their mortality. Luke pushed deeper, past the hunger, searching for anything that resembled compassion or reason, and he found a flicker, a memory of a time before the hunger, when Galactus had been something else, something smaller, something that had made a choice and paid for it with eternity. Luke spoke, not with words but with intent, projecting his thoughts across the impossible distance. He offered understanding, acknowledged the entity's nature, and then he made his plea. He showed Galactus the galaxy as he saw it, not as energy to be consumed, but as life interconnected through the Force. A web of existence where every death diminished the whole, where every world destroyed was a loss that could never be recovered. He asked not for mercy, because mercy implied a moral framework Galactus did not possess, but for consideration, for acknowledgement that this galaxy represented something worth preserving. The response came not in thoughts but in images. Galactus showed Luke the inevitability of heat death, the universe's slow march toward cold entropy, and positioned himself as a necessary part of that process. He showed Luke countless galaxies that had ended not through consumption but through their own conflicts, their own self-destruction, and implied that his hunger was at least efficient, at least purposeful. He showed Luke the truth that the Jedi had always feared that life and death were not opposites but partners in an eternal dance, and trying to preserve one at the expense of the other was folly. Luke felt himself drowning in that cosmic perspective, his human concerns rendered infinitesimal, his hopes exposed as the desperate bargaining of an insect. But then he felt the others, Mara's fierce determination, Kyle's stubborn defiance, Silgal's gentle strength. They were pulling him back, reminding him that even if they were small, even if they were temporary, their lives mattered. They mattered to each other. And in mattering, they created meaning that transcended entropy. Luke made his final offer, knowing it might be suicide. He would serve as herald if Galactus agreed to spare inhabited systems, to feed only on stars whose worlds were barren, whose energy could be consumed without ending sentient life. He felt the entity's attention sharpen, considering, and for a moment, hope flickered. But then Galactus rejected the offer, not with anger but with something worse, pity. He showed Luke the mathematics of his hunger, the rate at which he needed to feed to sustain himself, and made clear that limiting himself to uninhabited systems would mean starvation, weakness, and eventually, extinction. Galactus's survival required inhabited worlds. Life itself was the richest source of the energy he needed. The contact broke, and Luke collapsed, blood streaming from his nose and ears, his body convulsing as Silghal rushed to stabilize him. Mara caught him before he hit the floor, and Kyle called for medical assistance. But Luke was already regaining consciousness, his eyes wide with horror. He gasped out what he had learned, and the implications settled over them like a shroud. There would be no bargain, there would be no mercy. Galactus would feed, and they would die, and the galaxy would go dark system by system until nothing remained. Thrawn received the report in silence, his red eyes distant as he processed the failure. He had prepared contingencies, of course. He always had contingencies. But this situation defied even his strategic genius. If they could not negotiate and they could not fight, the only option remaining was retreat, an organized evacuation of the galaxy itself, if such a thing were even possible. He began calculating the logistics, the number of ships required, the time needed, the destinations that might be far enough to escape Galactus's reach. The numbers were staggering, impossible, but he worked through them anyway because the alternative was acceptance, and Thrawn had never accepted defeat. Leia's voice came through the comm again, and this time she brought news that changed everything. The Guardians of the Wills had made contact with an ancient order on Tython, the birthplace of the Jedi, and together they had uncovered a text, a prophecy written in the earliest days of Force scholarship. It spoke of a devourer, an entity from beyond the veil, and it hinted at a weapon, not a physical weapon, but a convergence, a moment when the Force itself could be wielded against an enemy that existed outside its influence. The prophecy was vague, as prophecies always were, but it mentioned the Prime Jedi, the first being to truly balance light and dark within themselves. Luke listened to the transmission and felt a chill run through him. He was not the Prime Jedi. That figure had existed millennia before him, and their wisdom had been lost to time. But he understood what the prophecy implied. If the Force could be unified, truly unified, without the divisions of light and dark that had defined Jedi philosophy for generations, it might be possible to create something powerful enough to challenge Galactus. It would require every Force-sensitive being in the galaxy to join together, to set aside their beliefs and allegiances, and become a single, focused instrument. It was, by any measure, impossible. But impossible had never stopped them before. Thrawn recognized the strategic value immediately. If they could gather the Force-sensitives, the Jedi, the dark side adepts, the neutral sects like the Wills and the Night Sisters, and combine their power, they would create the closest thing to a superweapon the galaxy possessed. It would not be enough to destroy Galactus, but it might be enough to hurt him, to drive him back through the rift, or at the very least, to close the tier and trap him on the other side. Thrawn began issuing orders, coordinating with Leia to send out calls across the galaxy, summoning every Force sensitive to Tython for a convergence that had never been attempted in recorded history. The response was overwhelming and chaotic. Jedi answered the call without hesitation, abandoning their posts and their students to converge on the ancient world. But others were more reluctant. The Night Sisters of Dathomir, practitioners of dark magics that predated the Sith, demanded guarantees of autonomy and safety. The Dark Jedi who had fled the Purge and carved out hidden sanctuaries wanted assurances they would not be arrested or executed. The Inquisitors, broken tools of the Emperor's will, saw an opportunity to reclaim power and respect. And the Sith, or what remained of them, saw only an opportunity to exploit the crisis for their own gain. Luke found himself in the role of mediator, negotiating with people who had every reason to hate him, who saw the light side of the Force as weakness and the Jedi as enemies. But he was patient, earnest, and utterly convinced of the rightness of their cause. He made no promises of amnesty or forgiveness. He offered only the truth. If they did not unite, everyone would die. The dark side practitioners would perish alongside the Jedi. The Sith would be consumed like everyone else. Galactus did not care about their allegiances. He only cared about the energy they represented. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to arrive. Dark and light, chaos and order, destruction and creation. They gathered on Tython, in the ancient temple complex where the Prime Jedi had once meditated, and they formed a circle that stretched for kilometers. Thousands of Force sensitives standing shoulder to shoulder, their differences momentarily forgotten in the face of annihilation. Luke stood at the center, and beside him, representing the dark, stood a woman cloaked in shadow, a former Sith apprentice named Vestara Kai who had abandoned her order but never her philosophy. Together, they would attempt to lead the convergence, to weave light and dark into a single tapestry. Chirrut and Baze positioned themselves at key points in the circle, the kyber crystals placed at intervals to amplify the Force, to create resonance between the gathered individuals. Thrawn observed from orbit aboard the Dauntless, monitoring the convergence through sensors while simultaneously coordinating the galaxy's remaining fleets. If the convergence failed, the fleets would engage the constructs in a delaying action, buying time for evacuations. It was a two-pronged strategy, and both prongs were desperately fragile. The convergence began at dawn, as the twin suns of Tython rose over the ancient stones. Luke and Vestara reached out simultaneously, he toward the light and she toward the dark, and they met in the middle, their powers intertwining. The other Force sensitives joined them, adding their strength, their understanding, their unique connections to the cosmic energy that bound all living things. The circle began to glow, a radiance that was neither pure light nor corrupting darkness, but something in between, something that shimmered with possibility. The Force itself seemed to awaken, responding to this unprecedented unity, and for a moment the galaxy held its breath. Luke felt the presence of every being in the circle, their fears and hopes, their regrets and dreams. He felt the dark-sider's hunger for power and the light-sider's yearning for peace. And he understood that both were expressions of the same fundamental truth, the desire to matter, to leave a mark on the universe before oblivion claimed them. He wove those desires together, channeling them into a single purpose: survival. The energy built, spiraling upward like a cyclone of pure force, and then it burst outward, a wave that rippled across the galaxy in an instant. Every Force sensitive not present at Tython felt it, a pulse of power so profound it made the Death Star's destruction feel like a whisper. The wave reached the rift, and for the first time since Galactus's arrival, the entity reacted. The constructs faltered, their feeding patterns disrupted, and through the tear in space, a sound echoed, a deep, resonant note that might have been surprise or acknowledgement. Galactus had noticed them. Luke pushed harder, demanding more from the convergence, and the circle responded, every individual pouring their essence into the effort. Light and dark ceased to have meaning as the boundaries dissolved, and what emerged was something primal, something that existed before the Jedi codified the Force into opposing sides. It was creation and destruction, order and chaos, all at once. It was the Force as it truly was, raw and unfiltered, and it was aimed directly at Galactus like a spear forged from reality itself. The spear struck the entity, and for the first time, Galactus felt pain. Not physical pain, his form transcended such concepts, but a disruption to his essence, a challenge to his nature. The galaxy had wounded him, and he recoiled, pulling his constructs back through the rift, retreating from this reality that had suddenly become hostile. Luke felt the entity's shock, his confusion, and beneath that, something that might have been respect. They had done the impossible. They had hurt a god, but the cost was devastating. The convergence had drained every participant, leaving them unconscious or barely coherent, their bodies starved of the energy that kept them alive. Luke collapsed, his heart stuttering, and Silgal staggered toward him, her own strength nearly gone. Around the circle, Force sensitives fell like leaves, some of them never to rise again. They had succeeded in driving Galactus back, but they had sacrificed a generation of Force users to do it. The light and dark had united, and in uniting, they had burned themselves out. Thrawn watched from the Dauntless as the rift began to close, the tear in space sealing itself as if the universe were healing from a wound. The constructs that remained in real space lost coherence, disintegrating into streams of energy that dissipated into the void. Galactus was retreating, and the galaxy was saved. For now, Thrawn ordered medical teams to the surface, coordinated relief efforts, and began the grim work of tallying casualties. They had won, but the victory felt hollow, Pyrrhic. The Jedi and their dark counterparts had paid the ultimate price, and the galaxy would never be the same. Luke regained consciousness 3 days later, his body weak but alive. Silgal had saved him, channeling what little strength she had left to stabilize his vital signs, and now he lay in a recovery chamber aboard the Dauntless, surrounded by the few survivors of the convergence. Vestara Kai was alive, though diminished. Her connection to the Force a fraction of what it had been. Chirrut and Baze had survived by remaining at the edge of the circle, their role as anchors protecting them from the worst of the drain. But so many others were gone, Jedi Masters, dark side adepts, neutral practitioners, 1,000 lights extinguished to save trillions. Leia visited him, her eyes red from crying, and she told him what the galaxy was saying. They called it the Convergence Sacrifice, the moment when light and dark set aside their eternal conflict to defend creation itself. Already, the story was spreading, becoming legend, inspiring hope in a population that had teetered on the edge of despair. The New Republic and the Empire had signed a temporary ceasefire, acknowledging that their squabbles were meaningless in the face of existential threats. And Thrawn had proposed a new initiative, a permanent monitoring station at the edge of the unknown regions, staffed by both Imperial and Republic forces, watching for any sign that the rift might reopen. Luke listened to it all and felt a profound weariness settle over him. They had won, yes, but he understood that Galactus had not been defeated, only delayed. The entity still existed beyond the veil, still hungered, and one day he might return, or perhaps he would find another galaxy, another reality to consume. The thought brought no comfort, only the cold certainty that the universe was larger and more terrible than they had ever imagined. Mara Jade entered the chamber, her movements stiff but determined, and she sat beside his bed without asking permission. She said what others were thinking but would not voice. The convergence had proven that unity was possible, that light and dark could work together when survival demanded it, but she doubted that unity would last. Already, factions were reforming, old grudges resurfacing. The Sith survivors were demanding recognition for their contribution. The Night Sisters wanted concessions. The Jedi were divided between those who saw the convergence as a necessary evolution and those who viewed it as heresy. Peace, Mara said, was always temporary. Luke could not argue with that. He had felt the strain within the convergence, the way centuries of conflict and philosophical differences threatened to tear them apart even as they united. But he had also felt something else, the potential for a new understanding, a new approach to the Force that transcended the rigid dogmas of Jedi and Sith. Perhaps that was the true legacy of the convergence, not the defeat of Galactus, but the seed of a philosophy that might grow in the years to come. He shared this thought with Mara, and she gave him a skeptical look that softened into something almost like hope. Thrawn summoned them to the bridge once Luke was strong enough to walk, and there, Displayed on the central hologram was the sealed rift. It no longer tore at space but remained as a scar, a reminder of what had nearly been. Thrawn explained that their scientists were studying the scar, trying to understand its properties, and initial findings suggested that it was stable for now. The energy readings from the other side had diminished to almost nothing, implying Galactus had moved on, seeking sustenance elsewhere. But the scar could reopen under the right conditions, a surge of dark side energy, a disruption to the Force on a galactic scale, or simply the passage of enough time. Luke asked what Thrawn proposed they do, and the Grand Admiral's answer was characteristically pragmatic. They would prepare, they would maintain the watch, study the scar, and develop contingencies for Galactus's potential return. They would also preserve the knowledge gained from the convergence, documenting the process, the costs, and the results, so that future generations would not have to rediscover this terrible solution under duress. And they would continue to seek other answers, other weapons, because relying on a single desperate gambit was not strategy, it was hope, and hope was not enough. The conversation shifted to practical matters, resource allocation, personnel assignments, political negotiations, and Luke found his attention drifting. He looked out the viewport at the stars. So many lights still burning, so much life still thriving, and he thought about the nature of survival. They had saved the galaxy by becoming something new, by breaking the old patterns and embracing a unity that should have been impossible. But unity required sacrifice, and sacrifice left scars deeper than any wound in space. Chirrut appeared beside him, his presence announced only by the soft tap of his staff. The Guardian spoke without preamble, his voice gentle but certain. The Force was pleased with what they had done, but it was also changed. The convergence had shifted something fundamental, broken a barrier that had existed for millennia. Light and dark would never be as separate as they once were, and that would bring both opportunity and danger. The Jedi and Sith had defined themselves through opposition, and without that clear division, both orders would need to redefine their purpose. Luke considered this and asked Chirrut if he believed the convergence had been worth the cost. Chirrut smiled, that serene expression that suggested he knew secrets the universe had not yet revealed. He said that worth was measured in generations, not moments, and they would not live to see the full consequences of what they had done. But the galaxy still existed, life still flourished, and that was enough. Baze, standing behind his partner, muttered that existence was overrated, but he said it with affection, and Luke understood that even the cynical warrior had found meaning in their struggle. The weeks that followed were a blur of recovery and reorganization. The survivors of the convergence were celebrated as heroes, but many of them retreated from public life, overwhelmed by the attention or haunted by the cost. Vestara Kai vanished into the unknown regions, taking a handful of dark side practitioners with her, and rumors spoke of a new order forming out there, neither Jedi nor Sith, but something that drew from both traditions. Luke did not try to stop her. He understood that the galaxy needed variety, needed different perspectives on the Force, and he trusted that the convergence had planted a seed of balance in all who participated. The political landscape shifted as well. The New Republic and the Empire maintained their ceasefire, though neither side trusted it to last. Mon Mothma proposed a joint council, a permanent body composed of representatives from all major factions, tasked with preparing for galactic-scale threats. Thrawn supported the initiative, seeing it as a logical extension of the lesson they had learned. Survival required cooperation, and cooperation required infrastructure. The council was established on Tython, at the site of the convergence, a symbolic gesture that honored those who had fallen. Luke returned to Endor, to the forest moon where his new Jedi Order was slowly taking shape, and he brought with him the knowledge gained from the convergence. He began teaching his students that the Force was not a war between light and dark, but a spectrum, a continuum where both served necessary functions. He emphasized balance, not as neutrality, but as the ability to draw from both sides without being consumed by either. It was a radical departure from traditional Jedi teaching, and some of his students embraced it while others resisted. But Luke was patient. He had learned that change came slowly, and forcing it only created backlash. Mara Jade remained at his side, her role shifting from reluctant ally to trusted advisor. She challenged his philosophies, tested his assumptions, and kept him grounded when his idealism threatened to blind him to practical dangers. Together, they began rebuilding the Jedi as something new, something that might survive the next crisis. Kyle Katarn and Silgal assisted, each bringing their own perspectives, and slowly, the Order grew. Not into the monastic institution that had fallen during the Clone Wars, but into a more flexible, more adaptive organization that could respond to a galaxy that refused to stay static. Thrawn returned to the unknown regions, taking the Dauntless and a small fleet to establish the monitoring station. He named it Sentinel, a fitting title for a project dedicated to vigilance. The station was crewed by volunteers from across the galaxy, and Thrawn himself spent much of his time there, studying the sealed rift, preparing for the day when Galactus might return. Leia visited occasionally, bringing supplies and news from the core worlds, and their conversations ranged from tactical assessments to philosophical debates. They did not become friends, exactly, but they developed a mutual respect born from shared trauma and shared purpose. One night, as Luke stood on the balcony of the Endor temple, watching the moons rise over the forest, he felt a presence in the Force familiar yet distant. It was Anakin, his father, appearing as a shimmering Force ghost, his expression peaceful. They had spoken little since Endor, but now Anakin approached, and they stood together in silence for a time. Finally, Anakin spoke, his voice carrying the weight of regret and pride. He said he had watched the convergence from beyond, and he had seen Luke do what he could never do: unite the galaxy without dominating it, lead without falling to tyranny. Luke had proven that redemption was possible, not just for individuals, but for entire philosophies. Luke accepted the praise with humility and asked his father if he believed Galactus would return. Anakin's answer was honest. He did not know. The Force showed many possible futures, and in some, the entity returned. In others, the scar remained sealed forever. But Anakin believed Luke was ready for whatever came, that the lessons learned from the convergence would guide the Jedi through the challenges ahead. And then, with a final reassurance, Anakin faded, leaving Luke alone with the stars. The galaxy moved on, as galaxies do. The convergence became legend, the Devourer a cautionary tale told to children and politicians alike. The scar at the edge of the unknown regions was marked on every star chart, a reminder of the day when light and dark had set aside their conflict to defend creation itself. And though peace remained elusive, though the Republic and Empire continued their Cold War, though the Jedi and Sith rebuilt their orders with wary eyes on each other, something fundamental had changed. They had faced annihilation and survived, not through superior firepower or strategic genius alone, but through unity. And that unity, fragile and imperfect as it was, offered a glimmer of hope that the galaxy might one day transcend its endless cycles of conflict. It was not a solution, not a happy ending, but it was a beginning. Luke Skywalker stood on the balcony as the first light of dawn touched the forest, and he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had done the impossible. They had hurt a god, and in doing so, they had proven that even the smallest lives, even the most insignificant beings, could shape the destiny of the cosmos. The Force flowed through him, light and dark in harmony, and he understood finally that balance was not a destination but a journey, an eternal effort to walk the line between extremes without falling into either abyss. The galaxy waited, always watching, always preparing for the next threat. But for now, there was peace. For now, the stars still burned.